America in the early 19th century was not yet the united power the world knows today. It was a growing experiment, stretched across vast land, expanding faster than its identity could keep up with. New states were forming, borders were moving westward, and the nation was constantly asking a question it could not answer clearly. What exactly was the United States meant to be? On the surface, the country appeared strong. Population was rising, industry was growing, and territory was expanding rapidly. But beneath that surface, two very different Americas were developing side by side. They shared a flag, a constitution, and a name, but their economic systems, social structures, and visions of the future were drifting further apart with every decade. In the North, cities expanded, factories multiplied, railroads spread, and industrial labor became the backbone of society. The economy relied on manufacturing, trade, and wage labor. Speed, efficiency, and growth defined the Northern mindset. Time itself became valuable. Productivity mattered more than tradition. In the South, society moved at a different pace. Agriculture dominated life. Wealth was tied to land, crops, and long-established systems of labor. Social hierarchy was rigid. Honor, status, and regional identity carried enormous weight. Change was viewed with suspicion, especially when it threatened the foundations of Southern power. These differences alone did not guarantee war. Nations have survived with internal contrast before. What made the situation dangerous was that every major national decision forced the country to choose between these two paths. Every new territory, every new state, every law passed by Congress became a battlefield long before the first shot was fired. As the United States expanded westward, a single question followed every new piece of land. Would it align with the North or the South? This question turned politics into a zero-sum game. Any gain for one side felt like an existential loss for the other. Compromise became harder, trust eroded, language grew more aggressive. By the 1850s, Americans were no longer debating policies. They were questioning each other's legitimacy. Newspapers described fellow citizens as enemies. Politicians spoke of betrayal. Regional loyalty began to outweigh national identity. People increasingly identified themselves not simply as Americans, but as Northerners or Southerners first. Violence did not begin on the battlefield. It began in words, then moved into streets, halls, and territories. Armed clashes erupted in disputed regions. Lawmakers carried weapons into government buildings. The idea that political disagreements could be settled peacefully was slowly dying. What made this collapse especially dangerous was the belief, on both sides, that the other could be forced to submit quickly. Many leaders believed that if conflict came, it would be short, decisive, and limited. Few understood what modern warfare, fueled by industry and mass mobilization, was about to unleash. When Abraham Lincoln was elected president in 1860, the tension finally snapped. His election did not introduce new divisions. It exposed how deep they already were. To many in the South, the political balance had been broken permanently. They no longer believed their future could exist within the Union. One by one, Southern states chose to leave. This act was not sudden or emotional. It was calculated, debated, and organized. Separate governments were formed, armies began to assemble, resources were seized. What had once been political disagreement became a direct challenge to national authority. For the North, this was not merely a political crisis. It was a question of survival. If states could leave whenever they disagreed, the United States would cease to exist as a nation. Allowing separation would mean admitting that the entire American experiment had failed. Still, even at this stage, many hoped war could be avoided. Negotiations continued, messages were exchanged, but trust was gone. Each side prepared for violence while publicly claiming to seek peace. The first shots of the Civil War were fired not in a massive battle, but in a symbolic confrontation. When cannons opened fire on Fort Sumter, it was more than an attack on a military installation. It was a declaration that compromise was dead. The country crossed a line from which there was no return. What followed shocked everyone. The war did not unfold like the short conflicts many had imagined. Instead, it became a grinding struggle that consumed entire regions. Armies grew larger than anything America had ever seen. Technology amplified destruction. Railroads moved troops at unprecedented speed. Factories produced weapons in massive quantities. For the first time, war touched nearly every civilian life. Farms were destroyed, cities burned, families were divided. Brothers found themselves fighting on opposite sides of the battlefield. The line between front and home disappeared. Early battles revealed a terrifying truth. Neither side was prepared for what this war would become. Commanders relied on outdated tactics while facing modern firepower. Casualties reached levels that stunned the public. Names of unfamiliar places became associated with unimaginable loss. As months turned into years, optimism vanished. Victory no longer seemed close or easy. The nation bled slowly, relentlessly. Each battle hardened the survivors and broke the spirits of those left behind. The Civil War was no longer about quick resolution. It became a test of endurance, resources, and will. The side that could sustain loss, adapt faster, and maintain internal stability would survive. The other would collapse. And this was only the beginning. The war was about to enter a phase far darker, more brutal, and more transformative than anyone had anticipated. Entire strategies would change. Leadership would be tested. The very meaning of America would be rewritten through fire and blood. America entered the Civil War with confidence, but without understanding. On both sides, there was a widespread belief that the conflict would be brief. Many assumed a few decisive battles would settle everything. Soldiers enlisted expecting adventure, honor, and a quick return home. Newspapers spoke of glory. Politicians promised victory. Very few imagined the scale of destruction that was about to unfold. The first major confrontations shattered those illusions almost immediately. Early battles revealed how unprepared both armies truly were. Commanders relied on outdated tactics borrowed from earlier wars, unaware that new weapons had transformed the battlefield. Rifled muskets increased range and accuracy. Artillery became more lethal. Dense formations turned into death traps. The Battle of Bull Run was a brutal awakening. Civilians arrived expecting a spectacle. Instead, they witnessed chaos, fear, and a shocking retreat. What was meant to be a demonstration of strength became proof that this war would not be simple. Panic spread through the North as reality set in. The South, encouraged by early success, believed victory was within reach. But neither side truly understood how to win a modern war. Leadership became one of the greatest weaknesses of the early years. Many generals were appointed not for skill, but for political loyalty or seniority. Some lacked imagination, others lacked discipline. Critical mistakes were repeated again and again. Opportunities were missed. Lives were wasted. Battles like Shiloh demonstrated a new level of brutality. Fighting raged for days without clear lines or order. The ground became soaked with blood. Casualties reached numbers that stunned the nation. Soldiers who survived carried psychological scars they did not yet have words to describe. As the war dragged on, the scale expanded. Armies grew larger. Logistics became decisive. Railroads were no longer just infrastructure. They were lifelines. The side that could move troops faster, supply them consistently, and replace losses efficiently gained an enormous advantage. War was no longer just about bravery. It was about systems. The North slowly began to realize this. Its industrial capacity allowed it to produce weapons, uniforms, ammunition, and supplies in quantities the South could not match. Factories worked continuously. Rail networks expanded. Rivers became strategic highways. Over time, this industrial advantage would become overwhelming, but in the early years, it was poorly utilized. The South, meanwhile, relied on determination, defensive strategy, and the belief that endurance would break Northern will. Familiar terrain offered advantages. Early victories reinforced confidence, but shortages became impossible to ignore. Supplies dwindled, transportation struggled. Replacing losses grew harder with every passing month. One of the most significant shifts in the war came with changes in leadership. Certain commanders began to understand that hesitation was fatal. Aggressive strategy, constant pressure, and total commitment were required. War could not be won defensively forever. As commanders adapted, the war transformed. It became more coordinated, more relentless, and far more destructive. Campaigns were no longer limited to isolated battles. Entire regions became targets. Infrastructure was destroyed deliberately. Civilians felt the war directly. The psychological toll was immense. Soldiers lived in constant fear, exhaustion, and uncertainty. Disease killed as many as bullets. Camps became breeding grounds for illness. Medical knowledge lagged behind reality. Survival often depended on luck as much as skill. Morale fluctuated wildly. Victories lifted spirits briefly, only to be crushed by the next casualty list. Families at home waited anxiously for letters that might never arrive. Communities mourned collectively. The war reshaped daily life far from the front lines. By the middle years of the conflict, it was clear that compromise was no longer possible. Too much blood had been spilled. Too many sacrifices had been made. The war took on a momentum of its own. Ending it without victory became unthinkable for both sides. Strategies hardened. Commanders accepted losses that would have been unimaginable earlier. The goal shifted from winning battles to breaking the enemy's ability to continue fighting. Endurance became the true measure of strength. This period marked the transition from a traditional conflict to something far more modern and terrifying. The Civil War was becoming a war of attrition, where victory would belong not to the most heroic but to the most resilient system. America was being reshaped by this process. The old assumptions of honor, quick resolution, and limited sacrifice were gone. In their place emerged a harsher understanding of power, survival, and cost. And the worst was still ahead. The war was about to enter its most devastating phase, where strategy would abandon restraint, and the nation would experience destruction on a scale it had never known before.